I took the overnight job at a county animal control facility because it was the kind of place where everything had a number, and every number matched something you could actually see in front of you. That was the point of the whole system: intake, hold, transfer, release. Nothing stayed in the building without being logged, and nothing got moved without a record following it from one end of the process to the other. I had worked places where that kind of structure broke down the moment things got busy, and I wasn't interested in dealing with that again. Nights were supposed to be simpler, fewer people, fewer variables, just routine checks and feeding schedules, and making sure everything stayed where it was supposed to until morning. The supervisor didn't spend much time explaining the job. He walked me through the rows of cages, showed me the terminal in the office, and handed me a printed sheet with a short list of rules. Most of it sounded practical. Lock every latch after feeding. Confirm every intake tag before logging. Don't move anything without updating the system. One rule didn't fit with the rest. If you find a cage that doesn't match its tag, you leave it alone and you don't check it again. On my third night, I found one marked vacant that reacted when I walked past it. The building itself was laid out in a way that made it easy to track movement without thinking about it too much. Long concrete corridors lined with metal cages on both sides, each one numbered, each one tied to a record you could pull up from the terminal without leaving your position. The noise wasn't constant. It came in waves, barking rising and falling in patterns that repeated night after night. The same animals reacting at the same times to the same sounds, like the place ran on a schedule, even when no one was actively managing it. That was how you knew the system was holding. When something broke that pattern, it stood out immediately. On most nights, nothing did. The cages stayed in sync with their tags. The records matched what you saw, and the only surprises came from new intakes that hadn't settled into the routine yet. That was what I expected when I started. That was what I had on the first 2 nights. The system mattered more than anything else in the building. That was clear from the way the supervisor talked about it without actually explaining it. He didn't say it directly, but everything he showed me pointed back to the same thing. If it's logged, it belongs. If it's not, you don't interact with it. That applied to animals, cages, tags, everything. The terminal in the office wasn't complicated, but it was strict. Every cage number tied to a record, every record tied to a status: occupied, vacant, hold, transfer. There was no room for something to exist without being placed somewhere in that structure first. That was what made the rule about mismatched cages stand out. It didn't tell you how to fix it. It told you not to engage with it at all. I didn't think about that rule much on the first couple of nights, because nothing triggered it. Everything lined up the way it was supposed to. I walked the rows, checked the tags, confirmed the records, and moved on without stopping longer than I needed to anywhere. The routine settled in quickly, and once it did, the place felt predictable enough that I didn't have to question anything I was seeing. That was the point of a system like that. It removed the need to guess. On the third night, I was halfway through the first full check when I noticed the cage that didn't fit, not because it looked different from the others, but because of what didn't line up when I passed it. The tag on the cage read vacant, same format as every other empty cage in the row, same clean label, same placement on the latch, where it was easy to read without stopping. The cage itself looked empty at first glance. No movement, no sound, nothing inside that caught the light in a way that would have made it stand out from the rest. I would have kept walking if it had stayed that way. Instead, something shifted the moment I passed it. Not a full movement, not something I could point to directly, just a change in the space inside the cage that didn't match the way it had looked a second earlier. I stopped without meaning to, took one step back, and looked at it again. The tag still read vacant. The cage still looked empty. Then it reacted a second time, subtle but clear enough that I knew I hadn't imagined the first one. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer than I needed to, not moving closer to the cage, not stepping away from it either, just holding that position where I could still tell myself I hadn't done anything yet. The shift inside the cage didn't repeat right away. Whatever I thought I had seen settled back into stillness. The same empty shape it had been when I first passed it. No sound, no movement, nothing that would have made me stop if I hadn't already been looking at it. I read the tag again, even though I knew what it said. Vacant. Same print, same placement, same format as every other empty cage in the row. I didn't reach for the latch. I didn't lean in. I stayed exactly where I was and tried to line up what I had just seen with what the system expected me to see, because that was how the job was supposed to work. If it was vacant, it stayed vacant. That was the record. That was the rule. I stepped back into the corridor and walked to the office instead of staying there any longer, not because I was convinced it was nothing, but because I needed the system to confirm it before I did anything else. The terminal sat where it always did, screen already active, the current shift loaded and waiting. I pulled up the cage number and checked the record the same way I had been shown on the first night, not rushing it, not skipping steps. The entry was clean. Status: vacant. Last update: earlier that day. Signed off by the day shift. No notes, no flags, no pending intake. Nothing that suggested anything had changed since then. I read through it twice anyway, slower the second time, looking for anything that might have been missed or left incomplete. There wasn't anything there. I stayed at the terminal longer than I needed to after that, not because I expected the record to change while I was looking at it, but because I didn't want to go back to the cage without something to anchor what I had seen to something official. The system didn't move. No updates, no corrections, no delayed entries from intake. Everything held exactly the way it had when I first pulled it up. That should have been enough. If the system said it was vacant, then it was vacant. That was how the place stayed consistent from one shift to the next. I told myself that again, not out loud, but clearly enough that it felt like a decision instead of a guess. Then I stepped away from the terminal and walked back toward the corridor. The cage looked the same when I came back. Same tag, same empty space inside. No sound, no movement. I stopped a few feet away this time instead of walking right past it, keeping a little distance between me and the latch without fully committing to leaving it alone. The rule came back to me the way it had been written. Not open it, not fix it, not check it again. I had already done one part of that by stopping. I stayed there long enough that the silence inside the cage started to feel deliberate instead of natural, like it was holding still because I was watching it instead of just being empty. I didn't move closer. I didn't reach out. I kept my hands at my sides and waited to see if it would react again. It didn't, not right away. The space inside the cage held steady, no shift, no sound, nothing that would have justified doing anything other than walking away. I stood there another second longer than I needed to, then stepped back and continued down the row, forcing myself into the same routine I had been following before I noticed it. Check the next tag, confirm the next number, move on. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, the pattern of the job had settled back into place around me, and the cage was just another point behind me that I hadn't interacted with. That was how it was supposed to stay. That was the rule. I finished the rest of the check without stopping again, but I didn't forget where it was, and I didn't forget what it had done when I passed it the first time. I finished the first round and logged the checks the way I was supposed to. 1 line per row, no notes unless something required action, no extra detail that didn't belong in the system. When I got to that cage number, I didn't add anything. Status stayed vacant, just like the record said. My hands paused over the keyboard for a second before I confirmed the entry, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I was aware of what I wasn't doing. I wasn't logging what I had seen. I wasn't marking a discrepancy. I wasn't opening a ticket. I closed the line and moved on. That was the first part of the rule. Don't correct it. The second part, don't check it again, sat there, waiting for the next pass. I finished the rest of the corridor and stood in the office a minute longer than I needed to, listening to the building settle back into its normal rhythm, the barking patterns falling into place, the air handling kicking in and out on the same intervals it had used all night. Nothing else was out of place. That made the cage stand out more. I went back to the terminal and pulled up the cage record again, not to verify it a second time in the corridor, but to make sure I hadn't missed anything in the log that would justify leaving it alone without thinking about it again. The entry didn't move. Same status, same timestamp, same clean line from the day shift. No addenda, no delayed notes, nothing that suggested anyone else had seen what I had seen and chosen not to record it. I checked the intake list for the last 48 hours, cross-referenced cage assignments, and ran through the transfer sheet even though there hadn't been any transfers scheduled for that wing. Everything aligned. The cage had been marked vacant, and it had stayed that way in the system through 2 complete cycles. That should have been enough to settle it. It didn't. It just removed any reason to expect help from the record if I went back. I started the second pass later than I normally would, not because I was delaying it on purpose, but because I kept finding small things to finish before I went back into the corridor again. Wipe down the counter, recheck the latch list, confirm the feed prep for the next round. None of it required a second look, but it filled time in a way that made the decision feel less immediate. When I finally stepped back into the row, the noise pattern was the same as before, controlled and predictable, each cage responding within the same narrow range it had earlier in the night. I kept my pace steady, not slowing down as I approached the section where that cage sat, not speeding up either. The rule was clear about the second check. Don't do it. Don't verify. Don't engage. I held to that for 3 cages, then 4. Then I reached the one before it and felt the difference in the air before I even looked at the tag. I kept my eyes forward for a second longer than I should have, letting myself pass the cage without stopping, because that was the simplest way to follow the rule. Don't check it again. Don't engage. Just move on. I did that. I took 2 steps past it, then 3, and the space behind me changed in a way that didn't match the rest of the row. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't movement I could point to. It was the absence of the pattern I had been following all night, a small break in the rhythm that made everything around it feel slightly out of alignment. I stopped without turning around, aware of where I was standing and what I had just chosen not to do. The rule covered this part too. Even if it didn't say it out loud, if it draws your attention, you don't give it more. I kept my shoulders square and took another step forward instead of looking back. I made it to the end of the row and turned at the corner, bringing the entire line of cages back into view from the opposite direction. From there, the cage didn't stand out the way it had when I was walking past it. Same spacing, same lighting, same clean tag on the latch. Vacant. No difference I could point to from that angle. I stood there a second longer, letting the perspective settle, then walked back along the opposite side, keeping my eyes on the general line instead of focusing on any one cage. When I reached it again, I didn't stop. I didn't slow. I let it pass in my peripheral vision, and for a moment, that felt like enough, like the rule held if I didn't give it direct attention. Then, just as it slipped out of view behind me, the space inside it reacted again. Not enough to name, but enough that I knew it had happened while I was deliberately not looking at it. I didn't turn around when it reacted the second time. That was the line I chose to hold, not because I was sure it was the right decision, but because it was the only one that still fit the rules as they had been given to me. Don't check it again. I kept walking, finished the pass, and logged the second round without adding anything to that cage's record. The system stayed clean. No discrepancies, no notes, no prompts asking for confirmation. I stood at the terminal after I closed the log and let my hands rest on the edge of the desk, waiting to see if anything would change without me touching it. Nothing did. The record held exactly the way it had before. That should have settled it. Instead, it shifted the pressure somewhere else, away from the system and back into the building itself, where I had to decide whether following the rule meant ignoring something that was still happening, whether I looked at it or not. I moved away from the terminal and stayed in the office longer than I needed to, listening to the pattern of the facility instead of watching it, letting the sounds come through the walls without attaching them to specific cages. The noise was consistent, the same rise and fall I had heard on the first 2 nights, the same timing, the same responses. Nothing broke that pattern. That was the part that didn't fit. If something was actually in that cage, it should have affected the rest of the row in some way, triggered a response, shifted the noise the way new intakes always did. It didn't. The rest of the building stayed aligned. Whatever was happening in that one space wasn't registering anywhere else, not in the system, not in the sound, not in anything I could measure without going back to it directly. I went back into the corridor for the third pass later than scheduled, not because I had forgotten, but because I wanted the delay to create a clear separation between the checks, something that would justify seeing it as a new pass instead of a continuation of the last one. That was the closest I could get to following the rule while still testing it. The lighting hadn't changed. The spacing hadn't changed. The tags read the same from a distance. I moved down the row at a steady pace, letting my eyes take in each cage in sequence without lingering, keeping the rhythm of the check intact. When I reached the section again, I kept my focus forward, not breaking stride, not letting my head turn toward the latch. The rule didn't say anything about awareness. It said, "Don't check it again." I stayed within that line as tightly as I could. I passed the cage without stopping, the same way I had on the previous pass, and this time the reaction came sooner, not behind me, but alongside me, within the same step I took as I moved past it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a clear movement. It was a shift in the space that felt immediate and local, like something had adjusted to my position in the corridor, rather than to anything I had done. I kept walking. I didn't look. I didn't slow. I held the rule in place and moved forward, letting the rest of the row come back into focus one cage at a time until the pattern reasserted itself and the moment passed. By the time I reached the end, my pace hadn't changed, but the distance I had covered felt longer than it should have. I logged the third pass without adding anything to that cage again, closing the entry with the same clean structure the system expected. No notes, no flags, nothing that would force a review in the morning. I stayed at the terminal after that, not because I expected it to update on its own, but because I wanted to see if leaving it alone completely would settle whatever was happening into something I could ignore. The record didn't change. The status stayed vacant. The timestamps held. Behind me, the building stayed in pattern, the noise controlled, the sequence intact. The only place the inconsistency existed was in the space I had chosen not to check. And the longer I held to that choice, the clearer it became that the rule wasn't there to hide it from the system. It was there to keep me from giving it the kind of attention that would make it behave differently. I held the rule through the rest of the shift, but it stopped feeling like something that protected the job and started feeling like something that shaped how I moved through the building. I didn't check the cage again directly, and I didn't add anything to the log, but I also didn't ignore where it was or what it had done when I passed it. By the time I started the next round, I had already decided I wasn't going to open it, and I wasn't going to touch the latch, but that didn't mean I couldn't test it without breaking the rule as it was written. The difference mattered. The rule said, "Don't check it again," but it didn't say anything about the rest of the row. I kept my pace steady and adjusted my path slightly as I approached the section, widening the distance between me and that cage without making it obvious I was doing it. If it was reacting to proximity, that would show up without me looking at it directly. I moved past the first few cages in that section without changing anything else about the routine, keeping my eyes on the tags in sequence, confirming numbers, logging them mentally the same way I always did before entering them at the terminal. When I reached the space where the cage sat, I shifted half a step farther out into the corridor, just enough to change the distance without stopping or turning. The reaction came again, not as a sound or a movement I could point to, but as a change in the air at that exact point, like the space inside the cage had adjusted to where I was instead of where it had been a second earlier. I didn't look. I didn't slow. I kept walking, held the rule in place, and finished the row without breaking stride. That was enough to tell me it wasn't random. I logged the pass the same way I had the others. No notes, no flags, nothing added to that cage's record, and then I stayed in the office long enough to decide what counted as a second check and what didn't. The rule was written simply, but the way it applied wasn't. If I walked past it again, that was a check. If I stood in front of it, that was a check. If I opened it, that was a violation. But what about the space around it? What about the corridor itself? The system didn't track that. The logs didn't reflect it. That was the part that gave me room to move without stepping directly across the line. I didn't need to see inside the cage again to confirm what it was doing. I needed to see how it behaved when I didn't give it what it had already responded to. I went back out and took the opposite side of the corridor this time, putting the row between me and the cage instead of passing directly alongside it. From that angle, I couldn't see the tag clearly, and I couldn't see into the cage without stopping and turning, which I didn't do. I kept my focus on the cages in front of me and let the one I was tracking fall into the space behind the row, out of direct view, but still within range if what I had seen depended on where I was. When I reached the midpoint of that section, the reaction came again, not in front of me, not behind me, but aligned with my position through the cages, like it was tracking me through the row instead of reacting to a direct pass. I stopped for half a second before I meant to, then kept moving, letting the rest of the pattern reassert itself before I reached the end. I went back to the office after that and stood at the terminal without opening the cage record this time, because the system wasn't going to tell me anything about what I had just confirmed. The entry would still read vacant. The timestamps would still hold. Nothing there was going to change unless I put something into it, and that was the part I wasn't allowed to do. I rested my hands on the edge of the desk and looked at the screen without interacting with it, letting the building settle behind me into the same controlled pattern it had held all night. The difference now was that I knew the pattern wasn't complete. There was something in it that didn't belong to the system, and the rule wasn't there to stop it. It was there to stop me from turning it into something the system would have to acknowledge. I didn't open the cage, and that mattered more than anything else I could have done at that point, because it kept me inside the line the rule had drawn, even while everything around it kept pushing me to step over it. What changed was how I started to move through the rest of the building after that. I wasn't just following the routine anymore. I was measuring it against that one space, using the rest of the corridor as a way to understand what that cage was doing without giving it direct attention. Every pass, every step, every position I held or changed became part of that measurement. I slowed down in sections that had nothing to do with it, sped up in others, shifted my distance from the row in ways that wouldn't stand out if anyone had been watching. Each time, the reaction from that cage aligned with where I was, not with anything else happening in the building, and that was the part that made it harder to treat it like something contained. By the time I reached the next scheduled round, I wasn't thinking about whether I should check it again. I was thinking about what counted as a check in the first place. The rule was written like a boundary, but it didn't define the edges of that boundary clearly enough to cover what I was seeing. I could pass it without looking. I could stand near it without stopping. I could move around it without engaging directly, and it still responded in ways that didn't fit with anything else in the system. That meant the rule wasn't about preventing interaction in the way I had first understood it. It was about limiting the kind of interaction that would force the system to recognize it. I kept that in mind as I moved through the corridor again, holding to the routine on the surface while letting everything else stay just outside of it. I approached the section again from the same side as before, keeping my path consistent so I could isolate what was changing and what wasn't. The cages ahead of it behaved the same way they had all night. Sound patterns holding, movement contained, nothing breaking the rhythm that defined that part of the building. When I reached the point where the cage sat, I didn't look at it. I kept my focus on the next tag in line and let my position do the work instead. The reaction came again, immediate and precise, aligned with where I was standing rather than anything I was doing. It didn't escalate. It didn't get louder or clearer. It stayed within that same narrow range, just enough to confirm that it was there and that it was tracking me through the space. I continued past it without stopping and finished the row, then doubled back through the opposite side again to repeat the same path from a different angle. The result didn't change. The reaction followed my position through the corridor, not tied to direction, not tied to pace, not tied to whether I was looking at it or not. It aligned with me, not with the cage itself. And that was the part that shifted how I understood the rule. It wasn't about what was inside that space. It was about how that space connected to where I was in relation to it. I stayed within the routine, logged the pass without adding anything, and stepped back into the office with that pattern settled enough that I didn't need to test it again immediately. I stood at the terminal without opening the cage record again, because there was nothing in the system that could reflect what I had just confirmed. The entry would still read vacant, and it would stay that way unless I forced a change. And forcing a change was the one thing the rule was clearly written to prevent. I rested my hands on the edge of the desk and looked at the screen without interacting with it, letting the rest of the building hold its pattern around me. The more I let it sit, the clearer it became that the cage wasn't the problem in the way I had first assumed. It was consistent. It behaved the same way every time. The inconsistency was in how I was supposed to respond to it, and the rule existed to keep that response within a range the system could ignore. I didn't go back to the cage directly after that, and that was the first time it felt like the rule was shaping more than just a single decision. It was setting the way I moved through the rest of the shift. I stayed in the office longer than I needed to, not because there was work to do, but because distance was the only thing that kept the pattern from pulling my attention back to that section of the corridor. The terminal stayed open in front of me, the active queue clean, every cage matched to a record the way it was supposed to be. If I only looked at the screen, the building was exactly what it claimed to be. That was the part that started to feel intentional. The system didn't reflect the cage, and the cage didn't disrupt the system. They existed side by side without intersecting, and the only place they overlapped was where I stood in relation to both. I went back into the corridor after a few minutes, not to check anything, but to confirm that the rest of the building still held together the way it had earlier. It did. The cages before that section behaved the same way they always had. Sound patterns consistent, movement contained, nothing breaking the rhythm. I kept my pace steady and stopped short of the section without fully committing to entering it, holding at the point where I could see the row without passing through it. From there, the cage didn't stand out. The tag read vacant, the interior looked empty, and nothing about it drew attention unless I moved closer. I stayed there for a second longer, testing the distance, and nothing happened. The reaction only came when I crossed into that space. I stepped into the section again, not because I needed to confirm it, but because I needed to see if the boundary was consistent. It was. The moment I crossed the same point I had on the previous passes, the shift came again, aligned with my position. not with any visible change inside the cage. I didn't look at it. I didn't slow. I kept moving, letting the pattern play out without engaging with it directly, and it held exactly the same way it had before. That was when it stopped feeling like something that was happening in the cage and started feeling like something that depended on where I was standing in the corridor. I finished the pass and went back to the office without logging anything new, because there was nothing in the system that would accept what I had just confirmed. The terminal still showed the cage as vacant, unchanged, unaffected by anything that had happened in the corridor. I stood there and looked at the screen without touching it, letting the two versions of the building exist separately in front of me. One was stable, structured, and complete. The other was consistent in a way the system didn't acknowledge, repeating the same response every time I moved through that space. The rule sat between those two, not as a restriction on what I could do, but as a way of keeping those two versions from overlapping in a way that would force one of them to give. I stayed at the terminal long enough to understand that the rule wasn't written to protect the system from errors or to protect me from making a mistake in the usual sense. It was there to keep the system intact by limiting how I interacted with something it didn't include. If I opened the cage, I would have to log it. If I logged it, the system would have to account for it. If the system accounted for it, something else would have to change to make room for it. The rule prevented that entire chain from starting. I stood there with my hands off the keyboard, looking at the clean structure on the screen and thinking about the space in the corridor that didn't belong to it. And for the first time since I took the job, it felt like the system wasn't incomplete. It was selective. I didn't react right away after that realization settled, not because it didn't matter, but because acting on it would have meant stepping directly into the one place the rule was written to keep me out of. I stayed at the terminal with my hands off the keyboard and watched the rest of the queue instead, confirming that everything else in the building still behaved the way it was supposed to. Intake entries held their timestamps. Holds stayed where they were placed. Transfers showed up in order, clean and accounted for. Nothing else in the system reflected what I had been seeing in the corridor. That separation stayed intact, no matter how long I looked at it. I glanced toward the doorway without moving, keeping the cage out of direct view, and tried to measure whether distance alone was enough to keep the pattern from engaging with me. It was. From where I stood, nothing reacted. The moment I stepped back into that section, it would. That was the boundary, and it didn't belong to the cage. It belonged to where I chose to stand. I went back into the corridor after a minute, not to test it again in the same way, but to confirm whether the boundary held if I approached it differently. I changed my pace, slowed before the section, then sped up slightly as I crossed into it, keeping my focus forward and my eyes on the tags that followed instead of the one I had been avoiding. The reaction still yapped at the same point, not tied to how fast I was moving or how long I lingered, but to the exact position where I entered that space. It didn't intensify. It didn't escalate. It remained consistent, as controlled as the rest of the building, just not acknowledged by it. I kept walking, finished the row, and turned at the end, bringing the entire line back into view again from a distance that didn't trigger anything. From there, it looked normal. That was the part that made it harder to treat it like an exception. I stood at the end of the corridor and watched the section without stepping into it again, letting the distance hold while I tried to understand what would happen if I ignored it completely for the rest of the shift. The rest of the building didn't change. The pattern held. The noise stayed controlled. Nothing spread from that space into anything else. It remained isolated, contained within a boundary that only seemed to exist when I crossed it. That was when the rule stopped feeling like a restriction and started feeling like a guide. It wasn't telling me what not to do. It was telling me where not to stand. If I stayed out of that position, the problem didn't exist in any way the system would recognize. If I stepped into it, it did, but only in relation to me. I went back to the office and stood at the terminal again without touching it, looking at the clean structure of the system and then back toward the corridor, letting both stay in my line of sight without forcing them to match. The more I held that separation, the clearer it became that the system wasn't incomplete or broken. It was consistent within the limits it defined, and the cage existed outside of those limits without disrupting them. The only thing that crossed between those two was my position. I was the point where they overlapped. The rule wasn't there to stop the cage. It was there to stop me from becoming that point. I stayed there for a while after that, not moving, not checking anything, just holding that understanding in place without testing it again immediately. The building continued to operate the way it always had. Every other cage aligned, every other record clean, every part of the system functioning without interruption. Nothing in it suggested there was anything wrong. That was the part that made it harder to ignore. If it had spread, if it had disrupted anything else, I would have had a reason to act. Instead, it stayed contained, precise, limited to a space that only existed when I stepped into it. I kept my hands off the terminal and my distance from the corridor, because that was the only way to keep both versions of the building separate, and I understood at that point that the moment I stopped doing that, I wouldn't just be observing it anymore. I didn't step back into that section right away after that, not because I was avoiding it, but because I had already seen enough to know what would happen if I did. The boundary held whether I crossed it once or 10 times, and crossing it again wouldn't give me anything I didn't already have. I stayed in the office and let the rest of the shift move forward without attaching myself to that one part of the building, focusing on the tasks that still fit inside the system instead of the space that didn't. I checked the next scheduled intake window, confirmed the feed timing for the remaining cages, and went through the routine the way it was written, keeping everything else aligned so I didn't have to justify going back. The system responded the way it always did, clean, consistent, complete, every action tied to a record that matched what I could see. That was the version of the job I had taken, and it still existed as long as I stayed inside it. I moved through the rest of the building without changing my pace or my path, letting the pattern hold while keeping the problem at a distance that didn't trigger it. Every other cage behaved exactly the way it should have. Sound levels consistent, movement contained, nothing out of place. I checked latches, confirmed tags, logged the pass without adding anything unnecessary, and kept the sequence intact from one end of the corridor to the other. The longer I stayed in that routine, the more it felt like the building was holding itself together around that one exclusion, like the system didn't need to account for it as long as it remained outside the range of what I was doing. That was the part that made the rule make sense in a way it hadn't earlier. It wasn't about ignoring something wrong. It was about maintaining everything else that was right. I went back to the office and stood at the terminal again, without opening the cage record, because there was nothing there that would change unless I forced it to. The entry would still read vacant. The timestamps would still hold. The system would remain complete within its own structure, regardless of what existed outside of it. I kept my hands off the keyboard and let the screen sit the way it was, resisting the impulse to pull the record up again, just to confirm what I already knew. That impulse was part of the same pull that had drawn me out into the lot in my last job. The same need to resolve something that didn't belong to the system I was working in. I stayed still long enough for that to pass, letting the absence of action settle into something that felt deliberate instead of incomplete. I returned to the corridor once more before the end of the shift, not to test the boundary again, but to confirm that holding to it hadn't changed anything else. I stopped short of the section and let my eyes move across the row without focusing on the cage, keeping the distance intact while still acknowledging where it was. Nothing reacted, nothing shifted. From that position, it didn't exist in any way that required a response. I stayed there for a second longer, then turned and walked the rest of the row in the opposite direction, maintaining the same separation, keeping the routine intact from start to finish without crossing into the space that would change it. The building held together the entire time. By the time the shift started to wind down, I understood that the rule wasn't something I had to keep remembering. It was something I had already followed by choosing where to stand and where not to. I finished the last set of checks, logged everything the way it was supposed to be logged, and left the rest exactly where it had settled without me. The system stayed clean. The building stayed in pattern. The cage remained in the one place that didn't belong to either of those, and as long as I didn't step into that space again, it didn't require anything from me. I stayed in the office until it was time to hand over, keeping my distance from the corridor, not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood at that point that the only way to stay outside of it was not to give it a position to respond to. I didn't go back into that section again before the end of the shift, and that was the first time the decision felt stable instead of something I had to keep reinforcing. The building stayed consistent around that choice. Every other part of the routine held exactly the way it had since I started, the system reflecting each step as I logged it, nothing drifting out of place, nothing requiring adjustment. The absence of that one interaction didn't create a gap anywhere else. That was the part I kept measuring without needing to write it down. If leaving it alone had caused something else to slip, I would have had a reason to step back into it. It didn't. The system remained complete within its own boundaries, and the corridor stayed aligned as long as I stayed out of the one position that triggered the response. That confirmed what I had already started to understand. The rule didn't exist because something needed to be fixed. It existed because nothing needed to change. I stood in the office for a while after the last log entry, not moving to shut anything down early, not stepping back into the corridor just to confirm what I had already confirmed. I let the building run without me for a few minutes, listening to the pattern hold on its own, the controlled noise rising and falling in the same intervals, the ventilation cycling through the same sequence it had followed all night. Nothing shifted when I wasn't actively tracking it. That was the difference between this and anything I had worked before. Normally, if you stepped away from the process, something would fall out of sync. Here, it didn't. The only part that depended on me was the part I had chosen not to enter. Everything else continued exactly the way it was supposed to. I checked the schedule for the next shift and the intake board for the morning, confirming that nothing was going to intersect with that section before I left. The layout stayed the same. No transfers into that row, no new assignments that would force someone to interact with that cage directly. That was enough to keep the boundary intact beyond my shift, at least for the next few hours. I didn't make a note of it. I didn't flag it. There was nowhere in the system to put something like that without breaking the structure it relied on. The absence of a field for it was part of the design. If it couldn't be entered, it didn't exist as far as the system was concerned. That was how it stayed contained. I looked toward the corridor one last time before the shift change, not stepping into it, not closing the distance, just letting it stay where it was in relation to me. From the office doorway, the row looked normal again. No difference in spacing, no visual break in the sequence of cages and tags. The section that had been pulling my attention all night didn't stand out unless I moved closer to it, and I didn't. I held where I was and let the perspective flatten it back into the rest of the building. That was the position the rule had been pointing me toward from the start. Not engagement, not correction, just distance. When the next shift came in, I handed over the keys and the log without adding anything extra. No explanation, no note about what I had seen or how I had chosen to handle it. There wasn't a way to explain it that would fit into the system they were working in, and there wasn't a reason to pull them into something that only existed when you stepped into it the wrong way. I signed off, stepped out into the early morning light, and left the building exactly as it had been when I walked in. Stable, contained, and complete within its own structure. I didn't look back at the corridor. I didn't check the system again before I left. I kept moving forward because at that point I understood that the only way to stay outside of it was not to give it a position to respond to anymore. I didn't plan on coming back the next night, but I did anyway, and the fact that it didn't feel like a decision was the first thing I noticed when I pulled into the lot. The building looked the same as it always had, low and flat against the dark, lights holding steady over the entrance, nothing about it standing out in a way that suggested anything inside it had shifted. I sat in my truck for a minute before going in, not because I was hesitating, but because I was measuring how much of the previous night I was carrying with me. It wasn't the cage itself. It wasn't even the rule. It was the awareness of position, the understanding that where I stood in relation to that space was the only thing that had ever changed anything. I got out, walked in, checked in the same way I had before, and took the keys without saying anything extra. The routine held from the first step, clean and predictable, the system loading exactly the way it was supposed to, the queue empty where it needed to be empty. That was the version of the job that existed if I stayed inside it. I started the first pass without adjusting anything, keeping my pace steady, letting the routine set the movement instead of thinking about where I was going. The cages responded the same way they had on every other normal night. Sound patterns holding, movement contained, nothing breaking the rhythm that defined that part of the building. I checked tags, confirmed numbers, let the sequence carry forward without interruption. When I reached the section where that cage sat, I didn't slow down, and I didn't widen my path. I held the same line I had taken at the end of the previous shift, the one that kept me outside of the position that triggered the response. The moment passed without anything changing. The tag read vacant. The interior held still. The space didn't shift. That was the confirmation. It wasn't about the cage changing. It was about whether I gave it the position it needed to respond. I finished the first pass and logged it without adding anything that didn't belong. The system taking the entry cleanly, every line closing without flags or prompts. I stayed at the terminal for a few seconds after confirming it, not because I expected anything to update on its own, but because I needed to see that the system didn't require anything from me beyond what I had already given it. It didn't. The queue remained stable. No delayed entries, no mismatches, no gaps that needed to be filled. I didn't open the cage record. I didn't check it again. There was nothing there that would change unless I forced it to, and forcing it was the one thing that would have pulled it into the system in a way it wasn't designed to hold. I stepped back from the desk and let that part remain untouched. The second pass held the same way, but this time I paid attention to the difference in how it felt instead of just whether it reacted. The first night, the space had pulled at my attention the moment I got close to it, not through sound or movement I could name, but through a break in the pattern that made it impossible to ignore. Now, that pull wasn't there. The pattern stayed intact because I wasn't stepping into the position that created the break. I moved through the row without deviation, checked each cage in sequence, and let that section pass the same way every other empty cage passed. Nothing shifted. Nothing reacted. The absence of that response was as consistent as the response had been before. That was what made it reliable. By the third pass, it didn't feel like I was avoiding anything anymore. It felt like I was following the actual procedure, the version of the job that kept everything aligned without forcing something into it that didn't belong there. I didn't think about the cage as I approached it. I didn't adjust consciously. I let the routine carry me through the space the same way it carried me through the rest of the building, and the result didn't change. The system stayed clean. The building stayed stable. The section remained exactly what it appeared to be from that position, another part of the row that didn't require anything from me. That was the balance the rule maintained, and it held as long as I stayed inside it. I finished the rest of the shift without changing anything else, and that was the part that mattered more than anything I could have done differently. The system continued to take each entry the same way it always had, clean and consistent, every log closing without delay, every cage accounted for within the structure it was designed to hold. I moved through the remaining checks with the same pace, the same sequence, the same attention to detail I had used from the start, and nothing broke the pattern. The absence of that one interaction didn't create a gap anywhere else. It didn't leave anything unresolved. It kept everything else intact in a way that felt deliberate instead of accidental. I stayed inside that routine until the last scheduled check was complete, not stepping outside of it even once, because I understood at that point that the only thing that had ever shifted the building out of alignment was where I chose to stand. I didn't go back into that section again before the shift ended. I stayed in the office for the last part of it, letting the building run without me actively tracking it, listening to the pattern hold on its own without needing to confirm it visually. The controlled noise rose and fell the same way it always did, the ventilation cycling through the same sequence, nothing drifting out of place, nothing spreading from that one part of the corridor into anything else. That was the part that confirmed it wasn't something that needed to be handled. It didn't expand. It didn't escalate. It remained contained within a boundary that only existed when I crossed it, and as long as I didn't, it stayed separate from everything I was responsible for. I checked the final logs before handover and closed them out without adding anything extra. No notes, no flags, no attempt to translate what I had seen into something the system could recognize. There was nowhere to put it, and that absence wasn't a flaw. It was part of how the system stayed complete. If it couldn't be entered, it didn't belong there. And if it didn't belong there, it didn't need to be resolved within it. I confirmed the entries, signed off on the shift, and left the record exactly as it was supposed to be, consistent with everything the system was designed to track. I looked toward the corridor one last time from the office doorway before leaving, not stepping into it, not closing the distance, just letting the row sit where it was in relation to me. From that position, it was normal. Every cage in line, every tag in place, nothing standing out, nothing pulling at my attention, nothing requiring a second look. The section that had shifted everything the first night didn't exist in any way that mattered from where I stood now. It only existed when I gave it the position it needed, and I didn't. I held that distance for a second longer, then turned away. I handed over the keys, confirmed the logs, and walked out into the early morning without looking back, letting the building remain what it was without carrying any part of it with me. The highway noise came through the same way it always did, steady and distant, the rest of the world moving forward without reference to anything inside that structure. I didn't check the system again. I didn't go back to the corridor. I didn't test the boundary once I left it behind. I kept moving forward because that was the only part of it that had ever required anything from me. And I understood at that point that as long as I didn't step into the place where it responded, it would remain exactly where it belonged, outside of everything I was there to do. By the next week, I didn't have to think about it anymore. I just knew exactly where not to stand. The city is quiet now. You should be too.